Hello, my name is Elizabeth Oakes. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. The title of my paper is Void, Connection, or Transformation: Representations of Altered Consciousness in American Science Fiction, 1960 to 1979, a computational stylistic corpus analysis. What can we learn about speculation by viewing the future through atypical mental perspectives? During the 1960s and 70s, science fiction began a process of increased diversification that continues today. Representations of altered consciousness, namely dreams, drug trips, and mental illness, became common. No longer merely a device to render villains abject, portraying altered consciousness allowed authors to explore different framings of social and cultural issues. In the science fiction of the 1960s and 70s, an increasingly varied range of authors imagined an increasingly varied range of futures through the trope of altered consciousness. Reading science fiction through the lens of altered consciousness highlights how inclusion of diverse, atypical mental perspectives enabled speculation that influenced sociocultural currents in ways that resonate even today. Using a blended computational stylistic approach that enables fluid adjustment of scale between distant and close reading, I identify three styles of representing altered states of consciousness in a corpus of American science fiction from the 1960s and 70s. I demonstrate how these styles generate distinct thematizations of altered states of consciousness, and finally I show how these thematizations drew from contemporaneous sociocultural issues and reconceptualized altered consciousness as a tool for speculating about alternative ways of resolving those issues. I take a quantitative computational approach combined with a qualitative stylistically framed reading on a corpus of 27 novels by Hugo or Nebula award-winning or nominated authors. As an additional criteria, all altered states are portrayed from the perspective of a focalizing character, so it's an interior, subjective experience of altered consciousness that's being represented. To maintain focus, I will only discuss the passages representing altered states today. Analysis on the altered state passages with Docuscope and the Regressive Imagery Dictionary, content analysis programs that categorize the words of a text according to rhetorical and psychological paradigms respectively, reveals lexical aspects of style across the entire corpus. Colin Martindale's Regressive Imagery Dictionary, or RID, contains about 3,000 words sorted into a triply nested structure. Martindale constructed the RID to identify categories of primary and secondary thought. The organization of this dictionary corresponds to a number of theories that locate cognition on a spectrum delimited by poles of primary or primordial, and which is concrete, irrational, and interior or idiosyncratic, and secondary or conceptual cognition, that is abstract, logical, purposeful, and reality-oriented. This distinction between primary and secondary thought corresponds to the differences in representation of altered and default states that I explore, as has been demonstrated and supported in studies by Martindale and others. The second dictionary program, David Coffer and Suguru Ishizaki's Docuscope, tags and categorizes words based on rhetorical effects, sentiment, and register. The dictionary is quite large in comparison to other content analysis dictionaries, about 100,000 words in 115 categories. Docuscope complements the RID by capturing the lexical features of literary styles with categories of description, character, and narration. Dictionary analysis identifies variables that distinguish different styles of representing altered consciousness. The corpus contains three stylistic groupings closely related to theme: the void and disorder group, the connection and communication group, and the perception and transformation group, with a handful of ungrouped texts remaining. The 10 authors in the first group thematize altered consciousness as void, a disordering of perception and reasoning that mask a lack or absence. Compared to default state passages, in altered passages, these authors use more of the RID's primary category words and fewer secondary category words. These are the roughest or highest level categories in the RID, and by summing the content of the dictionary's finer-grained categories, they summarize the difference between altered and default state consciousness. So, raising the percentage of primary category words and lowering the percentage of secondary category words in altered state passages compared to default passages creates a large primary minus secondary percentage difference. A second-level category of the RID that characterizes this group is Icarian imagery. This category contains words of height and depth and of ascent and descent. The altered state passages of these novels have comparatively high percentage of Icarian imagery words, that is, over 2.6%. Considering the docuscope data, the altered state passages in these novels tend to have higher percentages of description category words. Description contains two subcategories important to the discussion of the void and disorder group: sensory language, which contains nouns and adjectives of the sensory features of objects, and space movement, which contains prepositions, adverbs, and verbs describing movement through three-dimensional space. So, what does this style of altered consciousness look like in a novel? What are these words actually doing in context? Let's look at two altered state passages from Ursula K. Le Guin's 1971 novel, The Lathe of Heaven. The protagonist of The Lathe of Heaven, George Orr, has effective dreams that reshape reality. He begins dream therapy sessions in hopes of shutting off or controlling this ability, which distresses him. The dream therapist, however, uses a supposedly therapeutic machine to take control of Orr's dreams in an attempt to remake the world for the better. Yet these modified worlds become gradually worse, resulting in plague, an emotionally flat, desaturated world, and alien invasion. Establishing structure with Icarian imagery words, while placing strange images within this structure, characterizes Le Guin's style in The Lathe of Heaven. Le Guin's style of depicting altered consciousness is one of excess, a prolixity that masks the void at its heart. In this, she resembles other authors in the void and disorder group. Using Icarian imagery words, the authors in this group impose a subtle structure on the disorderly, the lacking, and the strange, allowing readers to experience it without becoming disoriented to the point of getting lost. The Lathe of Heaven opens with an altered state. The first passage on this slide, and in this first passage only Icarian imagery words have been underlined. The first quotation of 105 words contains 11 Icarian imagery words, just over 10%, a general characteristic of the altered consciousness passages in The Lathe of Heaven, shared with all novels in this group. Like the other authors in this group, Le Guin makes ample use of the height and depth words in this category to give a sense of movement through vertical space. She renders the jellyfish as a bobbing point in the vast empty space that the Icarian imagery words conjure. Particular to her style, she also uses many water words, a subcategory of Icarian imagery, in her altered state passages. Whereas other authors in this group, for example Dish and Zelazny, use Icarian imagery words to depict aerial swooping motions of an attention refusing to fix on some absence, Le Guin uses water to depict a kind of intimate contact with the void. It interpenetrates the jellyfish, a symbol for George Orr's consciousness submerged in dream. Yet often the altered consciousness in The Lathe of Heaven is characterized by this same rising and falling, an attempt to fill or avoid some absence with movement. Indeed, this passage is the first of many in which George Orr attempts to undo the ultimate absence, the complete destruction of his world, through his ability to transform dream into reality. The rising and falling of the Icarian imagery words and the proliferation of description captured by Docuscope's description category constitute a denial of the void lurking at the heart of the altered consciousness, even as the image of the jellyfish hints at the novel's resolution, the acknowledgement of void and the cessation of avoidance, a movement towards acceptance and simply being. Before reaching this resolution, however, Le Guin also uses a high percentage of Docuscope's description words, a first-level category that contains subcategories sensory language and space movement, to create an abundance of sensory images. In these same two quotations, Docuscope has underlined descriptive category strings in ochre, and I have added a touch of red to space movement subcategory language to distinguish it from the other subcategory sensory language. Le Guin makes heavy use of space movement in this first passage. Many are active verbs, but they all relate to actions of the natural environment. Sentence structures often delay the main verb, or sometimes it is an inverted sentence structure, so that the subject is also delayed. This creates a kind of stillness within an active style. So altered passage is slow at the syntactic level, sentences tend to be longer, and Le Guin plays with constituent order. Altered passages contain an unusual frequency of subject-object-verb ordered sentences, transposed and extraposed sentences, and sentences with heavy or multiple interposed clauses. The pace slows, noun phrases take precedence. This allows Le Guin to highlight the sensory language subcategory, which she molds into unusual images such as the stars blooming like big white daisies in the second quotation. Dreams represent an emphatic pause, letting Orr see the non-rational underpinnings of his world through striking images conveyed in sensory language. Defamiliarization arises from the syntactic techniques typical of dream passages. Language itself is made strange, and in turn, awareness heightens that recourse to assumptions and stereotypes is perilous. Readers are invited to reevaluate attitudes towards altered consciousness. Within the void and disorder group, authors often use high frequencies of descriptive words with an idiosyncratic syntax. Many of the authors in this group are renowned for distinct, finely crafted styles. While the particulars of Le Guin's syntax have been crafted specifically for the style of the Lathe of Heaven, complex syntax as a marker of altered consciousness is general to the group. For Le Guin, when altered consciousness is grasped or controlled, this results in an attempt to deny the void that is necessarily at its heart. This is what results in the negative valence of altered consciousness throughout most of the Lathe of Heaven. The void is filled with movement and images, but only when this ceases, when control is relinquished, can George Orr exist peaceably with altered consciousness as a natural part of his experience. Notably, it's an egotistical psychiatrist who is attempting to exert the control, a figure familiar from many of the novels in this group, including Dish, Lafferty, Zelazny, and indirectly in Bass and Randall as well. In contrast to Le Guin, other authors in the group, such as Bishop, Cherry, Dish, Farmer, Lafferty, and Zelazny, thematize the void as a weakness at the heart of altered consciousness. It's interesting to note that mainly New Wave science fiction and texts embracing the stylistic experiments that characterize the New Wave comprise the void and disorder group. New Wave's focus on inner space frequently results in projection of character-internal feelings of alienation and lack onto the natural world. However, New Wave speculative fiction opens a window into the cultural resonances of mental illness. This group of texts echoes both the skepticism about psychiatry and the negative assessment of mental illness common in the 1960s and 70s. Yet the portrayal of altered states is more sympathetic than many contemporaneous depictions. This group locates negativity in the vulnerability of the mentally ill rather than in the supposed dangers they pose. Le Guin speculates on ways of finding equilibrium through processing such atypical states of consciousness and learning to live with them, while other void and disorder authors at least question treatments worse than the condition. Although New Wave science fiction has been studied extensively in terms of its experimental style and its focus on the bleaker aspects of inner space, exploring the positive speculations that rise out of a negative portrayal of altered consciousness adds a new dimension. These speculations perhaps shaped the period's nascent awareness and destigmatization of mental illness. Moving on to the connection and communication group, The first, second, fourth, fifth, and sixth columns in this table show tendencies opposite the void and disorder group. This is an almost inverse style to the first group, and the thematization of altered consciousness also displays a polarity. Interestingly, this group is composed mostly of popular authors, many of whom are considered less stylistically experimental than those in the void and disorder group. Though that statement applies less to Philip K. Dick. Dick's altered state passages from the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch illustrate how authors of the connection and communication group use words from these categories to create a distinct yet often subtle style of depicting altered consciousness thematized as a site of connection and communication. In Dick's The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, a process of dispersion happens to focalizing character Barney Mayerson. In the novel, industrial tycoon Palmer Eldritch has brought back from a distant star system a drug that induces powerful hallucinatory experiences and allows the user to travel in ghostly form through time, but also allows Eldritch to co-inhabit the user's experience. In the passage on the slide, regressive knowledge words are italicized, primary words are underlined, and secondary words are bold. In this quotation, the secondary words have largely to do with thought or are time words that strengthen cohesion. Overall, the secondary category contains words that communicate conceptual, rational thought processes in alignment with social norms of thought and perception. Of the 14 secondary words, 5 indicate thought processes and 4 are time words. In contrast to the secondary category, the primary category words that depict thought processes as de-differentiated and idiosyncratic align towards subjective, intuitive thought processes and perceptions. Primary words in this passage describe the physicality of the environment and bodily perception of time. Dick evenly intersperses words from the primary and secondary categories throughout the passage. He does not create a sudden qualitative shift away from the default style of consciousness by switching between these categories as the quality of Barney's experience changes. Rather, a slight heightening of primary words creates a small but detectable difference in ratio, while secondary words underpin this alteration, maintaining a web of default style language to orient readers in narrative time and Barney's thought processes. Readers gain increased access to characters' subjective perception of time in altered state passages. Concomitantly, parallel descriptions of self, other, and environment increase. Yet similar levels of reporting organized thought and perception of self-exterior marked time remain. This is the main stylistic technique by which Dick creates a detectably altered style that maintains uncanny similarities with the style of default state consciousness. This stylistic choice is central to Dick's questioning and blurring of the boundaries of default and altered state experience. The RID's regressive knowledge words also play an important role in Dick's style of subtly differentiating consciousness types. The regressive knowledge category contains words of embodied self and its horizontal orientation in space. In the above passage, regressive knowledge words first relate to qualities of the form desired and the pathway to it, then shift to referring to the form itself, creating a lexical pathway from an outside view of the environment, contiguous with the omnipresent Palmer Eldritch, to an interior view of embodying Eldritch, who constitutes the whole hallucinatory world. Initially, Barney perceives the environment from an exterior perspective mediated by secondary thought words. When considering merging himself with the brass plaque from an exterior perspective, he reflects that it would endure a long time, and in addition, he knew that his future self would never abandon it. The feature of the environment is described with regressive knowledge words, but Barney separates himself from it through secondary language of thought. As his viewpoint becomes environment interior, he does not merely perceive Palmer Eldritch's hands as his own, but reminisces about it from Palmer's perspective, remembering a hand infinitely superior to the original one, long gone. Barney experiences through regressive knowledge words of subjective time and physicality rather than reflecting through secondary words of thought. The quality of the focalization varies between interior and distributed perspectives. This depicts a weakening of ego, a loss of the usual self-interior perspective. However, Marison's altered connection to objects and the environment, and later to his ex-wife, are achieved in a directed manner. As an upshot, Barney begins the journey of making peace with the loss of his ex-wife, begins his first steps into a new environmentally embedded lifestyle, and plays his unsung part in the defeat of Palmer Eldritch, whose totalizing mind threatens the subjectivities of everyone. In this way, Dick takes a positive view on ego relaxation, through altered consciousness, while still valuing intentionality and action. Dick ultimately identifies hope with connection to others, embodied embeddedness in the environment, and the struggle for sincere communication through the adversity of a shifting, indeterminate reality. Given the frequent characterization of Dick as an unremittingly dark author, I think there is value in exploring the hopeful aspects of his fiction. At a time when pollution and environmental degradation were peak concerns and climate change was beginning to be recognized, authors in the Connection and Communication group imagined environmental embeddedness and dissolution of boundaries between self and others as an empowering source of fulfillment. While elements of both utopia and dystopia may be present, characters do not take an oppositional attitude or experience the environment or others as enemies. Thematically, understanding the environment and others and living closely with them empowers the self in the mainly popular novels in this group. The underlying lexical style is one of positive and hopeful speculation, supporting a theme of environmental embeddedness as a source of resilience and self-realization. Although this group contains mainly popular authors, they take a much more progressive view of altered consciousness than the experimental authors in the Void and Disorder group. I have had less time to work on the Perception and Transformation group, so I'll just mention some general observations, but currently my supporting arguments are less complete than for the first two groups. The table shows some variables like the second, fourth, and fifth that distinguish it from the Void and Disorder group, and others like the first, sixth, and seventh that distinguish it from the Connection and Communication group. At first glance, the altered consciousness experienced by focalizers in the Perception and Transformation group seem of a piece with the experiences of characters in the Connection and Communication group. While the experiences reflect each other, the upshot for Perception and Transformation characters is markedly different. In this group, communion is achieved through vastly broadened perception, and its result is an utter transformation that leaves those who experience altered consciousness unable to live in their societies. The experience itself may be valued, but the result of the transformation on the individual is exile and death. In the novels in the Perception and Transformation group, knowledge comes at a steep price. While the abstract mentioned further cluster analysis in R, the project hasn't reached that state yet. However, I hope I've convincingly demonstrated the link between lexical categories, theme, and sociocultural currents. Thank you, and here are my sources.